राहुल सर ई क्लासेस में आपका स्वागत है। ऑनलाइन और ऑफलाइन कक्षाओं से जुड़ने के लिए हमारे YouTube चैनलों को सब्सक्राइब करना न भूलें। फेसबुक, इंस्टाग्राम और स्नैपचैट पर भी हमें फॉलो करें। ज्ञान बढ़ाने के लिए हमेशा तैयार रहें। हम आपके विकास के लिए समर्पित हैं। आपका धन्यवाद।
इस वीडियो में हम ए ट्रायम्फ ऑफ सर्जरी के सभी शॉर्ट क्वेश्चन तथा लॉन्ग क्वेश्चन को एक्सप्लेन करेंगे। तो बिना किसी देरी के वीडियो को शुरू करते हैं। Question 1. What was Mrs. Pumphrey's reaction when Tricky showed little enthusiasm for exertion? Answer. Mrs. Pumphrey was so frightened when she heard about Tricky's hospitalization. She was in tears. She knew that she can't live without Tricky. Mrs. Pumphrey became frightened and she thought, how could she live without Tricky? Question 2. What did Mrs. Pumphrey do to bring Tricky back to normal health? Was she wise? Answer. Mrs. Pumphrey thought that her dog was suffering from malnutrition, so she gave him some little extras like malt, cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks to bring him back to normal health. She was not wise in doing this because this worsened Tricky's health. Question 3. Why did Pumphrey make a frantic call to Mr. Harriet? Answer. Mrs. Pumphrey made a frantic call to Mr. Harriet because her loving pet dog had stopped eating anything. He even refused to eat his favorite dishes and sweets. He became inactive and lay motionless all the time. He began panting and had bouts of vomiting. Question 4. How can you say that Tricky had an affluent life? Answer. Tricky was a pampered pet of an affluent mistress. He had a wardrobe of tweed coats with separate coats for the cold and rainy weather. He had separate beds for day and night with lovely cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, supper bowl and lunch bowl. Question 5. How was Tricky an uninteresting object for other dogs? Answer. Tricky was considered an uninteresting object for other dogs because he was extremely overweight and lethargic due to being overfed by his owner, making him unable to participate in active play or even move around with the same agility as other dogs, essentially rendering him boring and not engaging for them to interact with. Question 6. What immediate steps did Mr. Harriet take to save Tricky? Answer. Mr. Harriet hospitalized Tricky for a fortnight and kept him on strict diet. By giving him a lot of water, he was able to make Tricky active and energetic once again. Thus, he was able to save him from any kind of surgery or medicinal treatment. Question 7. Which two suggestions did Dr. Harriet give to Mrs. Pomfrey at the initial stage? Did she follow? Answer. Dr. Harriet suggested Mrs. Pomfrey to cut down on the sweet things and not to give extra food to him. He also suggested her to give him more exercises and keep him on a very strict diet. Question 8. Why was Mrs. Pomfrey worried about Tricky? Answer. Pomfrey is worried about Tricky because he would eat nothing and spend all his time lying on the rug and panting. He refused to eat his favorite dishes and would have bouts of vomiting. Tricky did not want to go for walks or do anything at all. Question 9. Why was it a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Answer. The narrator was tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest because Mrs. Pomfrey had started bringing around 24 eggs at a time to build Tricky's strength. Later, she started sending bottles of wine to help enriching Tricky's blood. Question 10. How it can be said that Mrs. Pomfrey was a very loving and caring mistress for Tricky? Answer. Mrs. Pomfrey is considered a very loving and caring mistress for Tricky because she showered him with excessive attention and comfort, providing him with a luxurious lifestyle including special beds, clothes, and a variety of gourmet food, even when it negatively impacted his health. Questions number 1. Mr. Harriet. The veterinary surgeon is tactful as well as full of common sense. Justify this statement by giving instances from the story. A triumph of surgery. O. Answer. I think the narrator, a veterinary surgeon, seems to be a practical and tactful person. He knows how to deal with people. He adjusts himself well to the circumstances. He immediately understands Tricky's problem. Tricky doesn't suffer from any sort of illness. The main cause of his illness is overfeeding. He takes the dog to his surgery. There the doctor keeps him on water diet and makes him physically active and treats without any medicine. The dog gets well under his supervision and natural environment of surgery. Question 2. What advice did the doctor give to Mrs. Pomfrey? Why did she not follow it, and what excuse did she made? Answer. Dr. Harriet knew that the only fault of Tricky was his greed for food. Mrs. Pomfrey was an indulgent mistress and pampered Tricky with malt, cod liver oil, and bowls of Horlicks. Dr. Harriet had advised her to cut down on sweets and give him some exercise. Tricky was to be kept on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey told the doctor that it was very difficult. The result of ignoring the doctor's advice was disastrous. Tricky lost his appetite and lay motionless on the carpet. He vomited again and again. Question 3. Why did Mrs. Pumphrey say that it was a triumph of surgery? Did she know what Tricky's ailment was? Answer. Tricky was seriously ill. He refused food. He had bouts of vomiting. Mrs. Pumphrey was very much worried about him. She called Dr. Harriet, who was a vet surgeon. Dr. Harriet knew about Tricky's disease. He took the dog to his surgery. He gave Tricky no food for 2 days. He gave him a lot of exercise. When Mrs. Pumphrey went to Dr. Harriet's surgery to take Tricky back, she found him totally transformed. He had been very lazy and flabby, but now he had been transformed into a lithe and hard-muscled animal. All this made him say, "This is a triumph of surgery." No, Mrs. Pumphrey did not know about Tricky's ailment. She also did not know how he was cured. Question 4. Why did Mrs. Pumphrey thank Mr. Harriet? Answer. Mrs. Pumphrey thanked Mr. Harriet because he provided excellent care and treatment for her beloved pet. She appreciated his dedication, expertise, and the compassionate manner in which he handled the situation. Mr. Harriet's veterinary skills and genuine concern for the well-being of the animal touched her heart. She expressed her gratitude towards him for going above and beyond to ensure the health and happiness of her furry companion.